You wouldn't believe the chaos that unfolded the day an entitled HOA Karen tried to kick my guests off the lake, not realizing for a second that the property wasn't hers to control and that she had just picked the wrong person to mess with. And before I tell you exactly how her arrogance backfired, make sure you subscribe to Sham Stories, because what you're about to hear is a true roller coaster of HOA drama, entitlement, and one of the boldest confrontations I've ever faced. The kind that makes your jaw drop when you realize just how far someone will go to try to exert control where they have none. Because this wasn't just a case of a nosy neighbor peeking over a fence. This was a full-scale attempt by Karen and her clique to dictate who I was allowed to have on my own land and use the private lake that came with it. And it all began on what was supposed to be one of the most peaceful weekends of the summer, when I had invited a few friends, my cousins, and some colleagues from work to come enjoy the water, barbecue on the shore, and relax at the cabin I had built overlooking the lake, a place that had been in my family for decades, untouched by development, yet constantly targeted by the HOA that had been formed by the nearby subdivision, who thought they could expand their reach into my property because it bordered their manicured, cookie-cutter neighborhood. And though I had dealt with their petty letters, threats of fines, and complaints about community standards for years, I had never expected one of them to physically march down to my dock and try to evict my guests like she was the sheriff of the land. But that's exactly what Karen did, stomping across the lawn in her oversized sun hat, HOA badge hanging from a lanyard around her neck like she was some sort of authority figure, and yelling before she even reached us that outsiders weren't allowed to use the lake without HOA approval, her voice cutting through the air like nails on a chalkboard, freezing everyone mid-conversation as they turned to watch the spectacle, because Karen had a way of sucking the joy out of any gathering. And though most of my guests whispered asking who she was, I already knew her reputation from the endless stories neighbors had shared about how she patrolled the subdivision like a self-appointed cop, measuring grass with rulers, scolding kids for chalk drawings on driveways, and reporting families for leaving trash cans out too long. But this was a whole new level of intrusion as she planted herself at the edge of my dock, pointing at my friends with that sharp, condescending glare of hers, declaring that she didn't authorize this many visitors and that lake privileges were restricted to members only. And though I tried to stay calm at first, walking over to meet her halfway, I could see the confusion on my guests' faces, the awkwardness of being treated like trespassers when they had been invited, the unease in their eyes as Karen's sharp tone made them feel unwelcome on land that was rightfully mine. And I could feel the heat rising in my chest, because I wasn't about to let her ruin the day, so I told her point blank, "Karen, this is my land, this is my lake, and these are my guests. You have no authority here." But instead of backing down, she doubled down, puffing up her chest and pulling out a clipboard like she had come prepared to enforce some ridiculous rulebook, flipping pages as if she had legal backing, muttering about community access rights and unregistered visitors. And the sheer audacity of her performance would have been laughable if it hadn't been so infuriating. Because here I was, the rightful owner of private property, being lectured on how I was supposedly violating policies I had never signed up for. And when she saw that I wasn't budging, she turned her attention to my guests, telling them they had 5 minutes to pack up their things and leave the dock, or she'd call security, which immediately set off murmurs among my cousins who had traveled hours to be there. And I could see some of them already gathering their bags nervously, not wanting to be caught up in drama. But I raised my hand to stop them, stepping closer to Karen and lowering my voice so only she could hear, though my tone carried enough edge to make her flinch, as I repeated with even more firmness, "Karen, this is my private land. You don't get to decide who's here." And her face went pale for just a moment before twisting back into that smug expression, because Karen's never liked being told no. And she snapped back that I was misinformed and that the HOA had jurisdiction over all lakefront access, which was an outright lie I knew she was spewing in hopes of intimidating me. And while part of me wanted to laugh in her face, another part of me knew that letting her pull this stunt unchecked would only embolden her to try again. So I squared my shoulders, locked eyes with her, said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Karen, you need to leave right now, because if you don't, I'll make sure the HOA gets sued for harassment and trespassing." Which drew a collective gasp from the group and sent Karen's jaw dropping as she realized I wasn't bluffing. Because unlike many of my neighbors who caved under her pressure, I knew my rights. I had the deed, and I had no problem dragging the HOA through the mud if it came to that. And in that moment, I could see her falter, frozen between her desire to maintain control and her fear of legal consequences. And while she stammered for a response, I turned back to my guests with a smile, telling them to relax and enjoy themselves because we weren't going anywhere. And though some of them still looked uneasy, the shift in energy was undeniable. My words reassuring them that they were safe, that Karen's bark had no bite here, and that the lake wasn't going to be taken from us. Not today and not ever, but deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it, because Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. And as she stormed off with her clipboard, muttering threats under her breath about calling higher authorities, I could feel the storm brewing, because if I had learned anything from living near an HOA Karen, it was that once she set her sights on you, she would stop at nothing to try to bend you to her will. Even if it meant fabricating lies, calling in reinforcements, or dragging you into a battle you never asked for. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky and laughter returned to the shoreline, I knew that the fight for my lake, my land, and my freedom from the HOA's overreach had only just begun. The moment Karen realized she couldn't control who stepped onto my land was only the beginning of her meltdown. And by the next day, she had already found another excuse to stir chaos, this time by confronting my guests directly as they were, setting up near the water, accusing them of trespassing, even though they were clearly within my property boundaries. And when I walked down to address the situation, she immediately shifted into her usual self-righteous tone, declaring that she had every right as a member of the HOA to oversee what was happening on our community lake, as she liked to call it. And when I calmly reminded her that the deed to this entire section of land lakefront, and all was registered in my name alone and had nothing to do with the HOA, her face flushed a bright red, and she stammered before attempting to threaten me by saying that she would call the sheriff to have my guests removed. But I knew her intimidation was nothing but smoke. So I told her to go ahead because the sheriff already knew the boundary lines and had verified multiple times that my land was private. And sure enough, when she made the call, the responding deputy arrived, looking weary as if he had dealt with her antics before. And after I greeted him, I handed him the boundary survey papers again, which clearly marked the dividing line between my private lakefront and the HOA-controlled section. And as he read through the papers and shook his head, Karen stood fuming on the side, muttering about how unfair it was for one man to have so much control over the water, but the deputy simply told her to stop wasting their time with false complaints and warned her that continuing to make nuisance calls could lead to charges, which made her gasp in disbelief before storming away with her arms crossed like a child denied candy. Though I knew she wasn't done yet because people like her never quit after one defeat. And true to form, by the weekend, she had spread gossip through the neighborhood claiming I was planning to develop the lakefront into a private resort and would be charging fees to access the water, which of course sent several concerned neighbors to my door asking if it was true. And I patiently reassured them that I had no intention of shutting them out and that my guests were simply family friends enjoying the lake. But I could see the doubt Karen had planted in their minds. So I decided to host a small gathering at the cabin, inviting the neighbors to come by, enjoy food and drinks, and see for themselves that nothing sinister was happening. And during that gathering, I took the chance to walk them down to the property line, pointing out the markers and explaining that while the HOA had rights to the public section of the lake, my area was independently owned, and I wasn't planning to change that, which seemed to ease their concerns and even earn me a few allies, who admitted they were tired of Karen's controlling behavior anyway. But as the night went on, I noticed Karen lurking in the distance, glaring as though my goodwill with the neighbors was an act of betrayal against her. And I knew then that she was likely plotting her next move, something bigger and more desperate than gossip. Something that would put her directly at odds not just with me, but with the law itself. And the tension hung over the evening like a storm cloud ready to break, making me realize that the real battle with Karen had only just begun. By the following week, Karen's hostility escalated into something far more invasive than gossip because she decided that the HOA had a right to inspect my cabin. And one morning I woke up to the sound of footsteps on my porch, only to find her standing there with two men she had clearly roped in as her so-called compliance officers, each of them holding clipboards, as if that somehow gave them legal authority. And without even knocking, she announced that they were there too. Conduct a property inspection since, according to her, I had made unauthorized structural modifications that violated HOA guidelines, which was ridiculous because my cabin wasn't subject to HOA oversight in the first place. But her arrogance was so thick that she acted as though her word was law, and when I told her to leave immediately because she was trespassing, she raised her voice and claimed that failure to comply could result in fines and even legal seizure of my property, which made me laugh out loud. Not out of disrespect, but because the bluff was so bold it bordered on delusion, and while the two men shifted nervously behind her, clearly realizing they were being dragged into something they didn't fully understand, I stepped back inside and came out holding the stack of official deeds, survey maps, and legal documents proving my ownership and my exemption from HOA authority, which I then handed directly to the men while staring Karen in the eye, daring her to contradict the law. And as they skimmed the papers, their expressions changed from confidence to unease until one of them quietly said that everything looked legitimate. But Karen quickly snatched the documents back from their hands and dismissed their doubts, insisting that my papers were fake and that she would have the county verify them, yet before she could spew another threat. I pulled out my phone and told her that if she and her fake officers didn't leave within the next minute, I would call the sheriff again and file a trespassing complaint. And just the mention of the sheriff's name made her flinch because she knew another run-in with law enforcement would not go in her favor. So she stomped her foot like a spoiled child and dragged the two reluctant men back toward the street while shouting that this wasn't over. But instead of worrying, I felt a grim certainty settle over me because her persistence had crossed into obsession, and I knew that soon she would stop pretending with clipboards and inspections and turn instead to schemes that could put me and my property in real jeopardy. And that thought was confirmed later that evening when one of my neighbors, a kind older man named Richard, stopped by to warn me that Karen had been in the community hall, bragging about how she had friends in county offices who would help her force me out. And though I doubted she had as much power as she claimed, I also knew that people like her thrived on intimidation and manipulation, which meant her next attempt could very well involve falsifying complaints or even bribing local officials. And as Richard and I talked under the fading light of the setting sun, I realized that the battle had moved beyond petty HOA squabbles. Karen was now waging a war against me personally, one that could spill into dangerous territory if I wasn't prepared for the storm she was about to unleash. Karen's tantrum on my porch should have been the end of her little power play, but instead it became the spark that ignited her into an all-out crusade. And over the next several days I began to notice patterns that were impossible to dismiss as coincidence, like the county code enforcement office suddenly mailing me notices about illegal improvements on my property when I hadn't built a thing, or random strangers slowly driving past my cabin while taking pictures as if they were gathering evidence for some case. And while most people might have been rattled, I had been through worse storms in my life and knew immediately that this was Karen pulling strings in the background, leaning on her fabricated authority and using her connections to push me out of my own land. And I wasn't about to roll over and give her the satisfaction, so instead of panicking, I documented every single interaction, kept a thick folder of the fraudulent notices, and even installed discrete cameras around the cabin so that if Karen or her officers tried sneaking onto my property again, I'd have more than just my word to hand to the sheriff. But the real turning point came one late afternoon when I returned from fishing on the lake and spotted Karen in the distance, standing with a county truck parked beside her and pointing aggressively toward my cabin, as if she were conducting a guided tour of violations. And when I got closer, I saw two county workers, looking uncomfortable as Karen barked orders about where they should take pictures, clearly trying to bully them into writing me up. But when she saw me approaching, she straightened her back and, in her most self-important voice, declared that I was in serious violation of environmental and safety codes for modifying wetlands, which nearly made me laugh because the only thing I'd modified that week was my fishing line. So I walked right up, introduced myself calmly to the two workers, and pulled out my own stack of documents, including the survey maps and exemptions. That proved my property was outside HOA jurisdiction and fully compliant with county records. And as I handed them over, Karen tried to snatch the folder from my hand, but one of the men stepped between us and told her firmly that they needed to see the paperwork directly, and within minutes their confusion turned to clarity as they realized that not only were Karen's accusations false, but she had wasted their time dragging them out there. And they apologized to me on the spot while promising that no violations would be issued. Though before leaving, one of them leaned in and whispered that Karen had been calling their office non-stop, demanding action against me and claiming I was running illegal commercial operations out of my cabin, which explained the sudden wave of bogus notices. And though it infuriated me that she was weaponizing county resources, I also knew she was getting desperate because her schemes were being exposed at every turn. That night, while sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was spiraling into dangerous territory, because each defeat seemed to fuel her determination rather than slow her down. And sure enough, the next morning, I awoke to the sound of tires crunching gravel and stepped outside to find Karen herself. This time without backup, waving a thick binder stuffed with papers that she claimed were official HOA bylaws, proving I had no right to occupy my cabin without HOA approval, and she demanded that I vacate within 30 days or face enforcement actions, which would have been laughable if not for the intensity in her eyes, as if she truly believed she had the power to erase my ownership. But I told her calmly to leave my property before I called the sheriff. And when she refused, I walked inside, dialed the number, and within 20 minutes a deputy arrived, listened to both sides, and promptly told Karen that the HOA had zero jurisdiction here and that her repeated harassment was bordering on criminal. At which point she turned red, threw her binder to the ground, and screamed that this wasn't over before stomping away like a child denied candy. But the moment she was gone, I knew in my gut that the real fight had only just begun. Because someone like Karen didn't know how to lose gracefully, she would escalate until she either got what she wanted or destroyed herself trying. And unfortunately, that meant she might start crossing lines that could drag me deeper into a conflict I hadn't asked for but couldn't avoid. Over the next week, the harassment shifted into new forms. Anonymous complaints filed with the sheriff's office about loud parties at my cabin that never happened, strange cars idling near the property at odd hours, and even a letter slipped under my door claiming to be a final notice from the HOA about impending foreclosure, which was both absurd and illegal since they had no authority to foreclose on land they didn't govern. But the stunt revealed just how far Karen was willing to go with her lies. And though I wasn't frightened, I began to grow concerned about how her obsession might affect the neighbors around us, because good people like Richard had already expressed unease about the drama she stirred up at community meetings, where she painted me as a dangerous squatter who threatened their safety. And while most saw through her nonsense, I could sense a few were starting to waver under her constant barrage of fear-mongering. One evening, Richard came by again, visibly upset, and told me that Karen had proposed creating an HOA neighborhood watch with the specific purpose of monitoring my cabin. And she was even pushing for volunteers to patrol near my property, lying to catch me in supposed violations, which was nothing more than legalized stalking dressed up as civic duty. And though Richard swore most of the community found her idea ridiculous, he warned me to be careful because she had managed to recruit a handful of loyal followers who seemed eager to join her crusade. Hearing that only solidified my resolve that this battle was no longer about property lines or HOA bylaws. It was about standing up to a bully who believed she could twist rules, manipulate people, and trample rights to get her way. And I promised Richard that I wouldn't let her intimidate me into silence, because if she was willing to bring this fight into the public arena, then I would make sure everyone saw her for what she truly was. A power-hungry fraud, desperate to control what she had no claim over. As the week dragged on, the tension between Karen and me simmered just beneath the surface, spilling into every corner of the lakefront community in whispers and sideways glances from the neighbors. And although I tried to maintain my composure, her persistence was something that could wear down even the strongest patience. Because every morning I would wake to see her either standing by the property line with her arms folded like a self-appointed guardian of the neighborhood, or walking around with her phone out, snapping pictures of my land, my guests, my dock, and even my boat, as if she had been hired to gather evidence for some phantom court case that she believed would one day bring me down. But despite all of her theatrics, the truth remained unchanged. This was my private land, legally purchased, properly recorded, and secured with all the rights I was entitled to. And nothing she could do would alter that fact, though she seemed determined to test every boundary, both legal and personal, in her crusade to bend me to her will. It started one Saturday afternoon when my friend Thomas and his family came over with kayaks to enjoy the calm water, and Karen, noticing the sound of laughter from across the lake, stormed down the hill in her oversized sun hat and HOA badge, pinned to her blouse, her sandals slapping against the dock as she marched directly into their path, yelling that they were trespassing and demanding that they vacate immediately. But Thomas, who was a retired police officer with a calm but commanding presence, simply raised an eyebrow and replied with quiet authority that he was invited here by the owner, pointing at me as I walked down the slope, and when I arrived, Karen's face went red, the embarrassment mixing with anger as she stuttered something about HOA bylaws not permitting outside guests, to which I calmly reminded her that HOA bylaws did not apply to private property, not under their jurisdiction, and that unless she could produce a sheriff or a court order, she had no right to tell anyone where they could or could not be on my land. The other neighbors who had gathered at a distance, pretending to water their lawns or tidy up their porches while secretly listening to the exchange, clearly enjoyed the show, and while Karen's voice trembled with frustration, she ultimately stormed off, muttering under her breath about how "this isn't over," a phrase I had grown all too familiar with over the last few weeks. By that evening, she had already started circulating emails among the HOA board, accusing me of disrupting the peace and bringing in unregulated outside elements to the lake. And though some members supported her mostly out of fear of being targeted themselves, the others began to question whether she had crossed a line, because the reality was that her obsession with controlling everything and everyone around her was starting to alienate even the people she once counted as allies. Still, Karen wasn't ready to give up, and the very next morning, she escalated her crusade by calling the sheriff's department, filing a complaint that I was operating a public recreational business out of my cabin. And when the deputy showed up at my gate, he was almost apologetic as he explained why he was there. Because he already knew Karen's reputation, and after I showed him the deed, the surveys, and explained that my friends were simply guests, not paying customers, he chuckled and admitted that Karen had wasted his time again, warning me that, although she had the right to complain, she had no legal ground. And as he left, he shook his head and muttered, "That woman sure loves drama." The problem, however, was that Karen took the deputy's visit as proof that her strategy was working. And rather than backing down, she doubled down, holding an emergency HOA meeting that evening in which she proposed drafting a new set of community guidelines that would include restrictions on guest access, lake use, and noise levels rules she hoped could be enforced across the entire community, including my private parcel, which was laughable but concerning nonetheless, because I knew she thrived on manipulation and intimidation, and there was always the chance that she could convince enough frightened neighbors to side with her just to avoid becoming her next target. But what Karen didn't realize was that the more she pushed, the more determined I became to expose her lies. And I began documenting everything, every outburst, every accusation, every intrusion, collecting a folder of photographs, recordings, and written accounts from my guests and friends, all of whom were more than willing to sign statements about her harassment. And by the end of that week, I had compiled a stack of evidence thick enough to present before any judge, if it ever came to that. The breaking point came on Sunday when my niece Emma, a college student who had come out with a few friends to swim, found herself confronted by Karen at the water's edge, where Karen accused her of bringing unauthorized young people onto the lake, demanding IDs, and even threatening to call the police if they didn't leave immediately. And when Emma called me in tears, I rushed down only to find Karen shouting at the girls as if she were some kind of law enforcement officer, her voice echoing across the water, drawing even more attention from curious neighbors. I stepped between her and the kids, telling her in no uncertain terms that she was harassing my family, that she had crossed a line, and that if she didn't leave immediately, I would call the real police to file a harassment complaint. And, though she tried to bluster her way through with legal jargon she clearly didn't understand, the sight of me holding my phone, ready to dial, finally made her falter. She turned on her heel and stormed back up the hill. That night, however, the situation grew even uglier, because Karen, still fuming, launched a smear campaign on the neighborhood Facebook group, posting exaggerated and outright false claims that I was hosting wild parties on my land, that my guests were out-of-control drunks, and that my property was lowering the values of all surrounding homes. But what she didn't expect was the flood of comments that came pouring in from people who had lived near me long enough to know the truth, many of whom defended me publicly, calling her out for harassment and for trying to enforce rules where she had no authority, and the backlash was so strong that by midnight, she had deleted the post entirely, though the screenshots taken by others ensured her words wouldn't be forgotten. At this point, it became clear to me that Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was actively attempting to damage my reputation and quality of life and, though I had tried patience, calm explanations, and even humor to diffuse the situation, it was time to take the next step and ensure that her campaign against me ended once and for all. Because what she didn't know was that I had already contacted an attorney who specialized in property rights. And by Monday morning, I would be sitting in his office with my folder of evidence, ready to pursue a legal injunction that would finally draw a line Karen could not cross without facing real consequences. As the summer pressed on, the conflict with Karen only grew more layered and more intense. And I began to realize that while she had overplayed her hand and underestimated me from the start, she wasn't willing to let the humiliation of her previous defeats simply fade away. Instead, she had become more cunning, working behind the scenes, trying to manipulate rules and twist narratives, hoping to gain back the control she thought she had lost forever. And one warm August morning, as I prepared to host a family gathering at my cabin by the lake, she made her latest move, one that would test not just my patience, but also my strategy. For I knew I couldn't keep playing defense forever. I had to start taking control of the narrative and stop her from thinking. She could chip away at me little by little. And the timing couldn't have been more telling, because as my cousin's nieces and nephews arrived, bringing coolers of food and jet skis to enjoy the water, Karen appeared at the far end of the property line, standing like a sentry with her ever-present clipboard and cell phone in hand. Her arms crossed and her face already tight with disdain. She didn't walk over at first. She just stood there, glaring at the group of cars parked neatly in my driveway. Then at the children racing down toward the dock, and I could see her brain turning, as though she were calculating how she could spoil yet another perfectly normal day. And finally, after a few minutes of watching, she began her march toward me, her stride brisk, her lips moving as though she were rehearsing the words she was about to unleash. And sure enough, when she reached me, she wasted no time in launching into her speech. You can't just bring crowds of people here whenever you like. This lake is governed by community standards, and you are disrupting the peace with all this noise, not to mention parking all these vehicles and filling up the shoreline with jet skis and equipment. You're not above the rules just because you own a fancy cabin, she said, her voice sharp but also betraying a certain desperation. And I let her rant, standing with my arms folded as my relatives, who by now were well aware of Karen's antics from all the stories I'd told them, began to gather nearby, curious to see how this confrontation would play out. And when she finally paused to take a breath, I leaned in slightly, speaking slowly and deliberately. Karen, once again, this isn't HOA land. This isn't a community-controlled space. This is my private property, my deed, my shoreline, my dock and my land. You do not get to dictate who I bring here. how often they visit, or what they do while they're here as long as it's legal. Your rules stop at the edge of my property, and the only person disrupting the peace today is you, by marching over here and harassing me in front of my guests." And I watched as her eyes flickered, because deep down she knew I was right, but she couldn't let go of her obsession with control, so she pivoted, raising her phone like a weapon and threatening to call the sheriff, insisting that my large, unauthorized gathering violated safety standards. The moment she said that, my uncle chuckled audibly, shaking his head and muttering under his breath about how ridiculous it was that someone would go this far to pick a fight over people enjoying a summer day by the water. And Karen turned sharply toward him, glaring. "This doesn't concern you, sir. You're trespassing on private lake property regulated by the HOA. And if you don't leave, I will have you cited," she snapped. And that's when I stepped forward, taking the phone from her hand before she could dial, which startled her, though I handed it right back and said firmly, "If you want to embarrass yourself again in front of the sheriff's department, go right ahead, because the last time you tried this, the deputies reminded you that you had no jurisdiction here. And they even told you to stop filing false complaints. So unless you want to dig that hole deeper, I suggest you turn around and let us enjoy our day in peace." And the crowd of my family nodded in agreement, several of them even recording the exchange on their phones, because they too sensed that Karen's antics had crossed from annoying into outright harassment. And once again, the pressure of being confronted with logic and evidence left her momentarily speechless. But instead of backing down gracefully, she muttered something about taking this to the board and escalating it formally, before storming off, her heels clicking angrily against the wooden dock. And as she disappeared back across the property line, I couldn't help but shake my head, wondering how far she was willing to take this vendetta. Because it was becoming clear that she wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she was making it personal. She wanted me gone out of the area, out of the lake community, because my very presence seemed to undermine her fragile sense of authority. And as the day went on, and the family gathering carried forward, with children laughing on the dock, people diving into the cool water, and barbecue smoke drifting up from the grill, I reflected on the bigger picture, realizing that I couldn't simply keep swatting away Karen's attacks one by one. I needed to establish something more permanent, a way to safeguard my rights and protect my property from constant harassment. And so after everyone had gone home that evening, I sat down with my laptop and began drafting a series of letters, one to the sheriff's department formally documenting her repeated false reports, one to the HOA board outlining her behavior and the trespasses she had committed onto my land, and another to my attorney, requesting that we explore a cease and desist order, because if Karen wanted to play the legal game, I was more than ready to use the legal system to finally put her in her place. And over the next few days, as my letters were sent and acknowledged, I received confirmation from the sheriff's office that they were indeed opening a file to track her pattern of false calls, while my lawyer responded enthusiastically, agreeing that I had more than enough grounds to pursue formal action against her. And the HOA board predictably tried to distance themselves, claiming that Karen acted on her own and not as an official representative. Though I knew she had influence over several of the members and was probably already spinning her version of events to them, yet I also knew that documentation was power, and with each letter, each report, and each legal filing, I was building an iron wall around myself, a wall Karen wouldn't be able to climb no matter how many times she tried to swing her clipboard at me. But even with all that in motion, I had no illusions that she was done, because Karen was nothing if not persistent. And sure enough, a week later, as I sat on the porch sipping my morning coffee, I saw her once again lurking near the waterline, this time with two men in suits beside her, gesturing toward my property, pointing at the dock, the boathouse, even the picnic tables. And it was clear she was trying to recruit reinforcements, perhaps from the HOA board or some local zoning officials. Though I couldn't hear their conversation from where I sat, and instead of storming down to confront them, I stayed calm, picked up my phone and began recording from a distance, documenting yet another instance of her targeting me. And in that moment, it hit me that this battle wasn't about rules at all. It was about ego, power, and control, and I was prepared to fight it until the very end. Because one thing Karen hadn't yet realized was that every step she took to intimidate me only strengthened my resolve to push back twice as hard. And as the sun rose higher over the lake, casting long golden reflections across the water, I knew that the next confrontation was coming sooner rather than later. And when it did, I was going to be ready, more prepared than ever, because this war between Karen's obsession and my determination was only just reaching its peak. And the question wasn't whether she would strike again, but how. And whether she'd realize too late that her fixation was only paving the way for her own downfall. The day after Karen's last desperate attempt to claim authority over the lake, I woke to the sound of laughter echoing across the water, a welcome relief after weeks of chaos. And as I stepped out onto the deck with a cup of coffee, I saw my friends and family gathered at the dock, enjoying the peaceful morning without fear of interruption. But I knew deep down that Karen's silence wasn't born out of acceptance, but rather out of defeat that stung too much to bear. And the tension of waiting for her next move lingered in my chest like a storm waiting to break. Though I also understood that we had reached the end of her rope. She had thrown everything she could at me. From fake HOA rules to police calls, from trespassing to harassment, yet each time she only embarrassed herself more. And now the community had turned on her. Her neighbors no longer respected her. The board had cut ties with her antics, and she had isolated herself in a fortress of pride, unwilling to admit she was wrong, but still unable to back down gracefully. And as I watched the sun rise higher, painting the lake gold, I realized that what made her truly dangerous wasn't her so-called authority, but her sheer stubbornness. Because when someone like Karen felt cornered, that was when they lashed out the hardest. But what she didn't know was that I had prepared for this final chapter more than she could have imagined. And I had gathered every piece of documentation, every recorded interaction, and every legal opinion from my attorney, ensuring that if she ever dared to strike again, it would be the end of her reign not only at the lake, but in the community altogether. And so when a knock came at my cabin door later that afternoon, I wasn't surprised to find her standing there, her posture stiff, her face tight with a false smile, as though she were trying to cling to some shred of authority that had long slipped away. And before she could even speak, I said calmly, "Karen, if you're here about the lake again, save your breath. It's over." But she held her ground and snapped, "This isn't over. You think you've won? But you're only making this worse for yourself. The board may have turned on me, but I still have connections. And you'll see soon enough that you can't. Just ignore the rules of this community." And I laughed softly, shaking my head, because I knew that her so-called connections were nothing but empty threats. And I replied, "Karen, the only person making things worse is you. Everyone sees it. You're alone in this fight. And the more you push, the harder you fall." And her lips pressed into a thin line, but before she could retort, I handed her a thick envelope. And when she asked what it was, I said, "It's every single record of your harassment. Every complaint, every false report, every attempt you've made to trespass on my property. And guess what? It's already in the hands of my attorney and the county officials. So if you so much as step foot on my dock again, Karen, you're not just dealing with me, you're dealing with the law." And for the first time since this war began, I saw her facade crack, her eyes darting away, her fingers trembling as she clutched the envelope, because she realized she had lost not only her imaginary authority, but also her ability to intimidate. And without another word, she turned and stormed back down the path toward her house, the sound of her footsteps sharp against the gravel. But I knew this wasn't just her retreat, it was her collapse. Because when someone like Karen finally faced the reality that they had no power left, their only choice was to disappear. And over the following weeks, that's exactly what happened. She stopped coming to the lake, she stopped calling the cops, and eventually, rumors spread that she had resigned from the HOA board entirely. Her reputation so badly damaged that no one wanted her in charge anymore. And neighbors who once feared her now avoided her, leaving her isolated in her own bitterness. And meanwhile, life at the lake returned to the way it should have been from the start, peaceful, joyful, free of her constant interference. And I hosted gatherings without fear. My friends swam and fished without interruption. and the laughter of children echoed across the water without Karen storming in to ruin the fun. But the best part came a month later when I received a call from the county office informing me that my private land rights had been officially reinforced, with updated maps and documentation filed to ensure that no HOA could ever attempt to overreach again. And as I hung up the phone that day, I felt a sense of closure, knowing that not only had I defended my rights, but I had also exposed Karen for what she truly was, a bully who crumbled when faced with truth and law. And as summer stretched on, the cabin became more than just a retreat. It became a symbol of standing firm against injustice, a reminder that sometimes the loudest voices are not the strongest, and that real strength lies in patience, preparation, and resilience. And though Karen still lived nearby, she was no longer a threat. It's just a shadow of her former self, trapped in her own bitterness, while I, on the other hand, lived free, proud, and unbothered. And so to anyone who has ever faced their own Karen, remember this: stand your ground, know your rights, and don't let false authority scare you. Because at the end of the day, truth will always silence the loudest lies, and power rooted in bullying will always collapse under the weight of its own emptiness. And if you've been following my story all the way through, then you know that fighting back isn't about yelling louder. It's about being smarter, calmer, and stronger. And that's exactly what won me this battle at the lake. So if you enjoyed this journey, if you've ever dealt with someone like Karen, if you believe in standing up for yourself against bullies hiding behind fake authority, then stay with us for more, because this is just one of many HOA stories that expose the truth about how far people will go and how easily they can fall. And don't forget to subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel right now so you don't miss the next unbelievable story. Because trust me, the battles against HOA Karens are far from over, and the next one might just be wilder than this.